Are we heading into a recession? If we are, what does that mean for the Colorado housing market? Is the value of my home going down? What's going on? Welcome to the podcast Sold by Marco, giving you the current information you've got to know as a buyer, seller, or investor here in Denver. Let's waste no time today. Let's just get right into the topic. There is one word on everyone's mind right now: recession. This can be a scary term, but what actually is a recession? This is usually defined by a period of time where there's temporary economic decline, where trade and industrial activity are reduced. This is generally identified by the gross domestic product, GDP, for 2 successive quarters. Well, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, real GDP did decrease 1.6% in the first quarter of this year, 2022, which was followed by a decrease of 0.09% in the second quarter. So kind of looks like we're in a recession. However, some economists are pretty adamant this does not necessarily signal a recession because there are some broader indicators out there like unemployment, for example, that are still looking very, very healthy. So overall, there's not really a consensus that we have entered into a recession, but Americans generally seem to be convinced we are heading into one. There's a great news article about that in Newsweek that I'm going to post in the show notes of this podcast if you want to read more about that. So when we focus specifically on the housing market, there are some signs that we've already experienced some recession-like behaviors, particularly as this relates to new construction. As a result, new home sales for the month of June totaled around 590,000 across the United States. This was considerably lower than they were predicted to be. I've got another article I'm going to link in the show notes that was done by Housing Wire, so you can read more about what the expected new home sales were supposed to be. So during the previous period of economic expansion from 2008 to 2019, we saw extremely weak new home sales. So builders were missing their estimates for years and years and years. And then in 2018, as we saw the supply spike, interest rates had also gone up to 5%, and builders had to stall construction for almost 3 years because of the impact of their profitability. Today, interest rates are higher than that. They did go down between then and now, but even now they're above 5%. So the question is, will we see another period of building limbo? So the lack of inventory, which has remained far below demand, is without a doubt one of the biggest issues we have right now in the housing market. So while there's an imbalance between supply and demand, that's going to continue to drive prices up, but you're probably wondering, how long is this going to last? And fortunately, we're not looking at a bubble here. So let's look back at the crash of 2008. Since then, lending standards are so much tighter. Okay, so there's one thing. Another factor is, according to a recent article from Adam Data, 44.9% of homeowners are now equity rich, which means that the balance of their loan is 50% or less of the estimated market value of their home. So if their home is worth $1 million, if you owe $500,000 or less on the loan, according to this term, you are equity rich. So basically, banks are not handing out bad loans anymore, and the majority of homeowners have a very, very safe position in their mortgage. So they've got a lot of equity. So as long as the demand is outweighing the supply, prices will continue to rise. But what if we officially do enter a recession? Like, would that have an effect on home prices? And the short answer is yes, it would. However, it's really important to remember how strong the Colorado housing market is compared to a lot of other markets in the country. So Redfin recently released some very valuable data about which areas of the country might be the most susceptible to a to housing values going down in a recession. And the scale was from 1 to 100 based on a lot of different factors, with 100 being like the highest chance of a downturn. Denver scored a 53, which means our market is a lot more resilient than many other states that are out there. So even with these higher interest rates, the buyer demand in Colorado has continued to drive prices upward. Our current supply is 1.6 months of inventory, It's not very much. So for prices to actually go down, that number would have to be at 6 months or higher. We're nowhere near that. So like we discussed earlier, inventory is probably not going to catch up with the demand anytime soon. Another factor here, as a side note, is that Denver acts like a coastal city because we have this natural barrier with the mountains. There's just less area that people can build out to. It's one of the things that makes Denver so awesome. And in this case, it's one of the things that is keeping housing values very, very strong. So unless there's like a severe recession that stomps out all the buyer demand, we're not going to see housing prices or values go down. Not here in Colorado. Homeowners are generally in a very safe position to weather any potential storm. So overall, in Colorado, housing market is looking really strong and resilient enough to, if they're going to feel any impact to any potential recession, it's going to be very, very minor. Home ownership here is one of the greatest hedges you can have against inflation because you're locking in your rate, and it's your housing payment's probably your largest payment, right? So you're locking in your largest payment, and you've got a lot more financial stability in times of economic uncertainty. So I hope that all this has helped giving you some insight into the answers of the questions of what's happening with the housing market. Are we going into a recession? Are housing values going down? And just as a side note, little anecdote, I noticed that my Zestimate went down $35,000 yesterday. So like without any of this data, like if you're not sure what's going on, or if you trust your Zestimate is accurate and you see this, the kind of stuff can look scary, right? But I know my value did not go down by 35 grand. A Zestimate is using big data at its best, right? Sometimes it's right, but sometimes it's not. So kind of got to take that with a grain of salt. Anyway, hopefully all this information is helpful for you. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime. There are 4 really helpful articles that I've discussed in this episode. I'm going to link all of those in the show notes wherever you're checking out this podcast, so you can check that out, read even more details about the topics we discussed today. Signing off, this show is produced by Super Team Media. I'm your host, Marco Randazzo with 8Z Real Estate, and thank you so much for checking out this episode of the podcast, Sold by Marco.